So we have a very interesting topic in front of us today, which is relevant to one and all. As somebody mentioned earlier in the beginning, we have 71 startups and they are only growing. A lot of them, especially in the edtech sector, are undertaking major mergers and acquisitions. And hopefully we have some enterprising individuals here as well. So merging the business side along with the legal side, I would like to welcome all our esteemed panelists here. So not taking too much time, I would like to ask you, how have the last 18 months been for you? Let's start with you, Mr. Pranav.
Thanks, Urvi. The last 18 months, I've been at home wearing t-shirt and shorts or whatever the weather demanded, and basically worked more number of hours than what we used to work in office. It's been a tremendous ride, especially for us because we went through the entire IPO in the last month. We listed on NASDAQ, and I think everybody kind of read about it. So we are actually looking for a good vacation whenever the embargo for selling the share happens, and then I think I will call it that we actually enjoyed going through the IPO. Yeah.
Okay, so of course, not 18 years, 18 months as I stand corrected. So Mr. Saraf, what would you like to say with respect to deal making? How have things changed in the last 1.5 years since the lockdown as compared to the time period before that?
I think deal making, as what Pranav said, has never been better. You're sitting at home, just wearing a tie and a short, and then just getting on a call and discussing as if you are really formally dressed. And if there is a board meeting, then you just wear a jacket. So deal making that way has been more fun for lawyers. But I think if I want to give a perspective, really if you look at is last year, when we were hit by pandemic, the GDP numbers were down. There was a degrowth of 28%. 28% was a degrowth. And today, if you look at now, you go back and say if the GDP numbers are degrowth, corporate profits were all-time high, all-time low. Companies were stressed. And if you look at the facts and figure, the total M&A activity last year was up 30% over last year. And if you look at cross-border, that means people overseas trying to buy companies in India, that deal flow was 3 times, 3 times. So if you think about it, everything is low, companies are going bankrupt, and deal making is high. So it's a pretty interesting phase. And if you look at the private equity activity, private equity people who buy into companies, their activity was high 3 times. And that is an important part that we have to understand what was really going on. Today, I think my dad gets up in the morning and looks at the stock market and says, something is not right. And that is what it is, that everybody believes something is not right. And I thought maybe that if people are paying and buying companies, private equity is investing all the time. Deal making is all the time high. Among law firms, I think most law firms don't have bandwidth to do deals. So if that is the situation, there's something really wrong what people understand. And I want to talk a little bit why this is so that before I take your real question. The one important part is that really in last 2 years, the formal sector of Indian economy have really gone up. Informal sector, if you look at Oxfam report, the poor in India has become really poor. And I think the senior advocates like Pinky Anand sitting there, they are now doing virtual hearing across the country. So the rich is becoming richer. Powerful is becoming powerful. So it's a very, very interesting phase. And that is the reason why corporates are buying companies. Because right now the expanse is too big. Private equity, if you look at it, they are taking a long-term view that they understand that the growth of economy and formal economy will be very significant. And that is what is happening. So if you look at the IPO market, the first phase of IPO market was people were really selling equity because they were raising capital. Because if you look at the companies like PVR, you look at companies like banks, they were dead. They were actually selling to survive. That was the first phase. Today the phase is very different. Everybody is wanting to sell off. The private equity want an exit at a high valuation. So the phase has changed dramatically in last 18 months. And that is what it is, that today the deal flow, deal making is all-time high.
Okay, that was quite a head start we had over here. So, since we're talking about equity, we also have associated topics like fundraising and IPOs. So, with that, I would like to bring Ms. Roy virtually here with us. Ma'am, what has your experience been in the last 1.5 years, and how have things changed when it comes to mergers and acquisitions, IPO, and equity?
Thanks so much, Indy. So I think absolutely, just tagging on to what Mr. Saraf just said, it's been a phenomenal turnaround. D1. But also, if you kind of look at the sectors that have shown the biggest activity, it is, in many cases, it is sectors that haven't really had as much of a COVID impact as some of the other sectors. So, the large booms have come in technology across the board. And so I'm obviously talking about e-commerce given my earlier experience, but I'm also talking about things like digital payments, edtech, etc. And so I think that's one thing. The second thing is it's a very interesting phase, and not just for India, but I think even on a wider global basis, because we all know that there is growing geopolitical tensions, and those are actually playing out within our own borders and in several other country borders as well. And so we've seen, obviously, the recent change to the FDI laws, which prevent the flow of funds from some of our bordering countries. And so that's another really interesting thing, because, a lot of PE money that Mr. Saraf was talking about used to flow in from China earlier. And that has stopped under the new regulations. And yet we've seen increased PE activity. So again, a very interesting dynamic for me, right? I mean, you would think that it would drop, but it hasn't. And so we've got the dependencies on the Chinese PE, but it's gone up. The other thing I certainly, I've seen personally is the increase in the funds that are flowing in from sovereign wealth funds. And so, in my earlier sector, we certainly saw, interest coming in from the Middle East, Abu Dhabi and Qatar being the big players in that sense. And so I think that's another growing dynamic, and that's going to continue, especially in the next 18 months or so. I would certainly say that. So a lot of trends happening there. I don't want to usurp everybody else's talking points. So I'm gonna stop there and let somebody else have a shot at it.
Thank you so much, Ms. Roy. We have already established a substantial amount of precedent with the topic that we have at hand. So getting on to a slightly more fun part, Mr. Naqvi, we are pleased to welcome you. He's joining us virtually as well. So coming to some hard questions, what do you think, where is the legal boundary? What is an entrepreneur supposed to look at? Where is the legal threshold where one should just withdraw from a merger and acquisition? Where does the legal trouble actually start?
So legal trouble, I'll share something interesting with you, is that in one transaction that we handled last year, and as Mohit rightly said, the volume of transactions has gone up. Perhaps a lot of lucrative deals are available in the market, and therefore people are from abroad also. And I completely agree with that in many law firms, it's a bandwidth issue. When the pandemic started, corporate sector at least felt, litigation went down, but corporate sector felt, the corporate practice felt that the practice will go down, lesser deals will happen. But what we saw was exactly the opposite. So now coming on to the deals, coming to your question as to when is it a time to withdraw? I have seen investors withdrawing where due to compounding and due to some issues coming up during due diligence, the liabilities have been so huge that the investment would actually go into mitigating those liabilities if they invest. Actually came across 2 or 3 such instances in the last 1.5 years. The deal was then, of course, structured differently where you transfer the business to another entity, but it takes time. So the straightforward investment into an entity went into doldrums, and the investors decided. Now, this is also because I know India has been increasing and upping the penalties and more on compliance. And then there are automatic formulas on most of the websites. So if you have a non-compliance, you fill in the form, the calculation comes in. If you delay in RBI filing, you are asked to compound, the calculation comes in. Not substantive, but if the delay has been or a non-compliance has been discovered, which is a decade, from a decade back or so, then of course they become prohibitive in some transactions. So that is when investors withdraw. For example, the promoters, if they have to withdraw, of course it's a question which always comes in front of them, that how much should they be diluted. Now, it's their entity, it's their venture. The investor comes in, dilution takes place, though there are different forms of investments in which income, not all of them lead to dilution. But if the investor doesn't get exit, of course, at some point of the time, the control and the shareholding percentages go down. So it is another call for the promoters of usually the startups or mid-level entities. In the last couple of years, they have seen a lot of offers for investment. But the question has been that in an adverse situation, should they take in the investment? Would they be able to grow in the new dynamics when things are moving virtual? What is their business model? And would taking investment and not delivering lead them to ultimately in a position which is worse than what they are at today in terms of business and in terms of control over their own business? Those are the broad thoughts that I have.
Okay, thank you for enlightening us about the legal angles, which a lot of us would not know otherwise, especially for non-legal folks like me and others who have joined us virtually over here. So since we are talking about legal things and business, Mr. Mehra, I would like to ask you this question. Your company, Freshworks, has gone into IPO fairly recently. So when we talk about the legal angle and the startup system in India, what were the hang-ups that you faced when it came to encountering, say, the RBI rules or the government regulations in general, and how did you overcome them?
We got listed at NASDAQ, so a lot of things happened in the US. So RBI and other things did not play a role, but we had subsidiaries in India and across geographies all over the world. One of our tasks was to understand why do we have so many subsidiaries and how do we consolidate all of them, because it's been 10 years that we have been. And you know how business is. When you get funded, you want to expand in all verticals, all horizontals, and sometimes you just take business decisions over legal. Those are not bad decisions, but those are decisions that you have to live with, and then legal takes control of that. So not going too much about what were the issues, how do we resolve it. I think the point to note here is whether IPO or whether non-IPO, deal making is all about generating revenue. Now revenue can come from private equity, investment fund, somebody giving it from family, debt financing, invoice financing, raising it from public or raising it from your own consumers. I think this year we've seen about almost everything. Debt financing was not really a term. I think it's become a term. It's become more in fashion right now. So taking loan is now debt financing. IPO has always been the milestone for a company to achieve, for a private company to become public, and then behaving like one. So, and a couple of companies have gone public in this year. A lot of very good companies will go public this year, especially if you talk about Nykaa, Paytm, MobiKwik, and we're all waiting that. And I'm actually waiting. I kind of subscribe to everything, and nothing gets allotted to me. And similar with my friend circle also. But then the US market is also behaving very interesting. You have a robotics company which is raising 30 billion. You have a gaming company. You have a dating company, especially women-led. You have marketplaces for sale of used goods. You have all those types of companies which India will probably take some time to mature. We are just in the phase wherein we are in the primary phase, wherein some metallurgical company wants to raise money, some e-commerce wants to raise money, but those are really are ahead of us, and we should be watching how they grow or how they fall and learn from it in India and other geographies as well.
Okay, so given that Mr. Mehra has spoken about his personal experience and to some extent about the companies that are launching or have already launched their IPOs in India. So speaking about IPOs, I wanted to ask you that where do we draw the line when it comes to ethical money making? Because there's a lot of talk about IPOs and people wanting to make quick money out of it, or some people want to just pay up their venture capitalists who had invested earlier. So, where do you think the line should be drawn when it comes to ethics? Because I know legal angle and ethical angle go hand in hand to some extent, or should I say to a large extent, being politically correct. What is your view on that, sir?
Money making is necessarily cannot be termed as unethical. I think, in my view, that is a problem which our bureaucrats feel, the government feels, and everybody thinks that if somebody is making money, there's something wrong. I think that is the first thing we have to get out, because really at the end of the day, we have left the mixed economy, a socialist economy, take long time back. So money making is not a bad idea. The whole idea is if you're using wrong means to make money, that's a bad idea. So making IPO, if you're raising capital to expand business and you've taken private equity money and you're giving them an exit, it's not a wrong idea. It's a good idea. It's an idea of growth. And that is, IPO again is the same thing, that you're providing exit to existing investors, allowing new equity partners to participate and list. So typically, I think when you do, I think the entire IPO exercise, we should think about like an investment idea, not a trading idea. People buy and hold. And people trade also. And again, traders are also not a bad people. It's not, they understand opportunities, they are knowledgeable. It's not that it's easy to make money without being knowledgeable. So that is one thing. But I would basically just add one point, which was the earlier question, is when do you leave deals? And I thought maybe, how do the deals go bust? Just to add my perspective. Really, if you look at the deals are in the market because seller wants to sell the company. Now, why does he want to sell? That's the important part. One is he's raising capital for growth. If he's raising capital for growth because he sees growth, he will sell. He will not withdraw. If he's wanting to sell the company because you have a problem, like a Z TV problem, you have a crisis, you have a debt crisis, then he has no choice but to sell. Whatever the price is, and if he doesn't sell in time, then the wound is much more. And you can see that how Z has happened. So I would say that is the seller issue. Now, for the buyer issue, typically if you are buying a company and it fits well with your activity, you will buy the company. You will only not buy if the price is very high. It doesn't make sense to buy. I think we all go to markets. Sometimes we look at a Louis Vuitton and we don't end up buying it because the price is not right. So the same thing, the buyers do it. Or there is a fundamental flaw. Like if you are a foreign investor and you get regulated in UK and US for bribery and corruption laws. And the guy on the other side is the Indian lawyer. He's saying, hey, we can't talk about foreign laws. FCPA is a foreign law. UK bribery is a foreign law. That is something which puts people at risk and they will walk out of the deal. The other thing, I remember one deal, I was doing a deal and we were representing for a private equity investor. And that was the time when a lot of these, the land of all these hospitals in India were all given by the state government. And it was given to a trust. And then they converted the trust to some way into companies. And that was a one hospital business. So we were looking at it and said, this is a non-profit business and you are talking about a 32% or 20% IRR. This is not going to happen very easily. And that is the time when you call it a fatal flaw in the deal. That a trust, unless you get it converted, this is a fatal flaw. That's the type of thing people just walk out. Otherwise, typically, the more you invest time in a deal, you never walk out. I think that's what I've understood is that never say no in the first meeting. Keep going on, keep making progress. By the time the buyers and sellers have invested way too much time that they can't just walk out. And that's how the deal gets done. So people who have less patience, they walk out quickly and they blow the deal. But if people who have more patience, they end up closing the deal.
Yes, patience is needed, of course, in every field and in most day-to-day activities. But given our immediate gratification era, it's wearing out. But that's a topic for another day. So coming back to what we have at hand, Ms. Roy, I would like to bring you into the discussion now. Since we are on the topic of ethics and trust, I wanted to ask you a similar question, but not the same. How would you say one should balance legalities with good motives when it comes to acquisition of one company by another?
So, if you really look at the corporate chatter out there, right now one of the biggest topics is around ESG, which is environment, sustainability and governance. And more companies are actually looking at the ESG metrics and the ESG financial reporting of other companies before going into purchase. Now, this trend hasn't necessarily picked up in India yet. It is certainly a major trend across Europe and the UK, and in the US as well now. But I would expect that this is going to be a trend that will trickle into through our shows as well. And so I think just it comes right to your point, right? The heart of your point is it's not just about the way that companies are making money, but it's also about what are they giving back. And I think that's going to be a question more and more investors are going to start asking, because that giving back is now tantamount to and leading to financial impact, right? Whether a negative financial impact from lack of action, or a positive financial impact in terms of value addition, etc. So I think more and more when we're doing diligence in the process of deal making, ESG is going to be a factor that we're going to look at more and more as buyers, or especially as buyers. So I think that's one. I think Mohit, I totally agree with all of the points you said, and I think one of the big mistakes companies often make. So I'm obviously on the other side, right? We're talking from the law firm, external counsel perspective, but one of the things we make is we get too personally invested sometimes in a transaction. And that's when that sort of, the tie-in comes in as well, and the inability to walk away from it. But for me, there are some big catch points there, right? One is, have we made a mess of the way we've looked at our financial synergies between the two companies? Because at the end of the road, it all boils down to that, right? Whether we can find that financial synergy. The second thing is, for me, in many situations, I've found completion mechanisms have unraveled the deal. So, how you set a valuation for a company that you're trying to purchase, but at what stage you determine that valuation and what room you give yourself as both a buyer and a seller to adjust that valuation as you go along can become a great space of debate if it isn't set out very clearly in the course of the transaction. And then, you're too invested in the transaction, etc. So, a couple of additional thoughts there.
You make an interesting point, Ms. Roy, about the ESG compliance. So that brings me to my next question, which is directed towards you, Mr. Mehra. Towards you. Can I request you to pick the mic, please? Yeah. So as somebody who is the CEO and founder of a new age company called Freshworks, how pivotal was ESG compliance when you were, say, having a discussion with your investors or any of the legal luminaries you may have encountered along the way? What were the legal, particulars you had to fulfill before you registered your company in the past 18 months?
That's a tricky one, I would say. I think there's no straightforward answer to that, because every company's growth cycle is different. Everybody is in a different industry. Being in IT, you don't have to follow as much as environmental norms as maybe in manufacturing setup. But then you have to deliver to your shareholders and investors that you're doing the right thing, not exploiting what is not meant to be exploited. So with us, it didn't really take too much of an effort. To the best of my ability, since we were working from home, we didn't print much of paper. And I think that what we call is that we were ESG compliant. But other than that, it didn't really, wasn't really required.
Okay, so yes, saving paper, saying no to plastic and the like is new age ESG we are all familiar with on a day-to-day basis, with some states like, say, Maharashtra banning it all out together and other states following suit. So having learned about a real-life experience, Mr. Naqvi, I wanted to ask you, given that we have a vast legal audience over here, can you enlighten us about what a new age entrepreneur or somebody who's about to strike a deal, what ESG laws or rules should they be wary of before they even think about making a new business venture?
It is very sector specific. It is very specific to the business. It is very specific to the plans. So generally, of course, as you rightly said, save paper and don't use plastic. Those are the general ideas, but there is no common and general list which is kind of a checklist. Of course, there are checklists which are related to when you come to form a company. That law applies to everyone equally, right? If you're getting a foreign investment, you have FEMA, which applies to most of you, depending upon the sector that you are in equally. So the applicability of different laws Some of them are general, like tax laws would apply to everyone, depending upon the turnover you may be taxable. Company, if you have to form, it applies equally to everyone. You may need some additional certifications if you are a different type of company. But a lot of these specific laws are depending upon the business. If you are a pure plug and play business, if you are absolutely in the virtual world, then you have to look for more of the data privacy things rather than physical waste and related to pollution related laws. So it's very sector specific. It's not a general customized thing. Is that how I look at it?
Okay, so we are running behind schedule slightly. So if we have any questions from the audience, yes, please. Can somebody give him the mic? You can also specify who the question is directed towards.
So it is directed to Mohit sir. Sir, I want to understand how a lawyer who serves private clientele, who has private companies as his clients, coordinate with government. How lawyers can be a catalyst to boost the public-private partnership and boost the economy, ensure equitable growth, and all those things. Yeah.
I think the important thing what you have to appreciate is when you are a corporate lawyer and in public-private partnership, there is a huge amount of contracts. The entire PPP structure is all contractual in nature. And the basic principle of PPP projects are that typically the risk of a project should stay with that party which is best suited to handle that risk. That is the first important principle of a PPP project. So really what lawyers can do is help identify risk in the project and making sure that the risk stays with the appropriate party. Like let's assume change in law. Now change in law is whose risk? It's a government risk, right? So who changes the law? Government. So that risk stays with the government. Now if that stays with the private party, a power developer, that doesn't work. So that is the way. The real lawyers really is to make sure that the risk allocation is appropriate, and they have to make sure that there are some of the deals you require approval processes. You have to help them to get that approval, because whether it's like listing in India, you have to work with SEBI. If it's a capital account issue, then you have to work with RBI. If it's an insurance sector, you have to work with IRDA. So what you need to do is find out a way to handle the risk and get approvals and facilitate. And I think one important part which we sometimes miss in India is whether it's a litigation or whether it's a M&A transaction or a corporate transaction, except when you're litigating to get fundamental rights and things like that, all these transactions are all commercial transactions. You have to understand that is the first part. M&A deals, disputes like Amazon, Reliance, these are all commercial deals. Only that lawyer will be able to really serve the client, who can understand and appreciate what does the client want and why does he want, and he can have intellectual discussion both on law and business. And if you are able to do that, you are a very effective lawyer. But if you can keep like what right now Pranav said, that if you get to a CEO and send him a 2-pager, 5-pager note saying this section says this and that section says, you've lost the client, you lost your CEO. So that is an important part, and I think that is an important part if you look at lawyers in India and lawyers outside. Lawyers outside focus a little bit more on business, because being lawyers, we know law. वो तो basic है. What is not basic is not understanding business. And we believe understanding business is something not right, because we just look down on business. And that is where the problem is. Like making money is bad, looking down on facilitating business is bad. And that is where the problem is. So I would say, to be a very effective lawyer, you need to understand commercial objectives, whether it required some support from the government or you required it from private party, and help mitigate that risk, find a structure. If you are able to do that, you are a very effective lawyer. And you don't need 20 years of practice. In the second year, you can be that one.
I would really like to have
Yes,
Pranav
please.
sir's insights on
Yes,
that.
please.
I will say, as in-house lawyer, you focus less on law, you focus more on business, you understand where the revenue is coming in and you understand where the revenue is going out as spends. And then when you're able to kind of bridge the gap as legal because you put in contracts to bring revenue in and you're putting procurement process to a point wherein you don't overspend or when you spend, you're able to recover back in what happened last year, force majeure clauses. We have several events running throughout the year in different countries to promote our brand, right? And when force majeure, when pandemic happened, nothing of it was happening. You had hotels, you had organizers, everybody was paid off in the year for 10 events. An organizer like this usually does about an event twice a week or sometimes twice a month, depending upon how big or what are the industries they cater. So you really need to understand your paperwork well, but then you need to go back to the business and understand what can I do as value add? What do I do as a value add? Because this can really be done by juniors in the team, right? So you need to understand the process. You need to design the architecture of what the product is, what is it delivering, where are the points wherein it can go bad. In case of a car or automobile, you actually know as in-house how many complaints you're getting. I don't want to say, I just took an example of something, but as software also you understand, how much downtime you're having. As someone in a robotics industry, they will understand why doesn't it happen all the time so accurate, because there's a 99.9%, but there's still 0.1% where it will go bad. Once you understand that, you being a lawyer for so many years, you're able to bridge the gap, because then you deliver to the client what you can actually do. You don't take more warranties, you don't give much indemnities, and you deliver to your best. And I think that will make you a good lawyer when you understand both law and business. Business, when I say bringing revenue to the business, because business do not keep lawyers for spending, they keep lawyers for bringing revenue, and it should be ethical and sustainable.
Do we have any more questions? Yes, please, sir.
Sorry, so the question can be addressed by anyone, sir. So RBI yesterday came up with a limitation for NBFCs to fund IPO buyouts, basically, which will be effective April 2022, about 1 crore. Do you see that this will actually create a rush in the industry for the companies to try and ensure that the IPOs are launched pre-April? Or how do you see whether it will disrupt the industry, HNIs who borrow, lend further, and try to disrupt it? Will it actually impact the IPO subscription, and to what extent overall?
Let me give you the answer. IPOs are never successful or never fail because somebody is able to borrow and list. I think that only creates to that think that this issue is getting subscribed 75 times and 80 times. So IPOs fail when business model fail. I think there can be a lot of like people making quick money, and therefore people are borrowing and making money and then selling. But these are irrelevant issues. I think this is a very good move by RBI because it will bring financial stability to the system. At the end of the day, the valuations are all-time high, and therefore getting banks and NBFCs to fund. Banks and NBFC have their own limits anyway. Right now, they're trying to just drop this over-exuberance in the market. And I think, in my view, that is the role of a regulator. That if you are able to do that, so that madness stops. And which is because this is, in my personal view, this is a cycle of 10, 12 years. We are just about to start. We are of 1990 of China, which went on for 30 years. So we are first 10, 12 years going to be crazy in India. And therefore, it is very good for RBI, SEBI and other regulators to bring these type of policies, which somebody will say it's against the market forces. The other will say that this will actually let the party last long, and we are able to build our infrastructure. We are able to get in the same party. The Chinese per capita moved from $2,000 to $6,000 per capita. And this is our time to become to 6,000. So we have to always look at bad parties, bad issues, and then clean it up. So that is what government is doing. It's a good thing. Nothing will change. Maybe subscription of 68 times will become 20 times. That's all.
Do we have any more questions from... yes, please.
A very good afternoon to all the speakers. I'm a second year student at Lloyd Law College. So, as we all know that net value of our nation is very low in comparison to others. And as Mohit sir has told that money making is not a bad thing. So, my question to you is whether this money making process will prove bane to the nation's financial growth, overall financial growth, or it will be a boon to nation's idea of सबका साथ सबका विकास.
देखो, whenever the money is made, the first part of the money is सबका साथ सबका विकास. That is the first part. And this is how the policy work. Now, if you look at an Oxfam report this year, the rich has become richer globally. And that is a problem, that the rich becomes richer. And which creates more disparity in countries like India. If you look at the top billionaires, they increased their wealth in last 18 months by 38%. And if you look at the bottom of pyramid, they could not. They actually had, because there was a loss of job. But if that is one part of it, because when you are working from home, people are able to do much more, and people particularly who have data connectivity, who have right instrument, who are in the right industry, they are able to do that. So that is the reason why this is happening. But overall, this is the same time in China. If you look at China, in 1980, the per capita income of China was lower than India's. We were higher. Today, we are 1/3 of China per capita. Per capita is basically the GDP divided by population. So that means what is the money which every individual makes. And we are at $2,000, they are $6,000. So really when the proper growth happens, and that is the reason why this is important, when there is a growth, it will lead to more jobs. More jobs mean more consumption, and overall the economy grows. So eventually that is what will happen. The trickle down of growth eventually happens, but rich always become richer. And that is the advantage, but that doesn't mean the bottom doesn't move up. Today, if you look at our bottom 800 million people who make less than $2 a day, they are really at the bottom of the world. And that is what the whole aim is. And therefore, yes, rich will benefit a little bit more, but if the bottom of India, 800 million people move up, I think India will be very different.
Yes, we are moving from what should I say, as I call it in my immediate friend circle, from a demographic dividend to demographic disaster, if the divide is not bridged soon, if I may say so. Given that we are about to end our discussion, I would like to end by asking one question to each of our panelists. Given that we are focusing on deal making, what do you think is the future in a hybrid workspace when we come to startups and deal makings and mergers and acquisitions? Mr. Naqvi, we'll start with you.
So I think we have become very habitual of, and rightfully so, of having virtual conferences, virtual meetings, virtual discussions. And as a lawyer appearing in the court, I am also becoming very habitual of appearing across India, sitting in my office, which was a task earlier impossible. In fact, I am a little scared now, thinking that the courts will open physically, and then it would be very difficult again to handle matters in different courts on the same day, different courts in different cities. So what is that? We expect that at least for litigation, the hybrid structure continues to work. That would be a great benefit. Also from the point of view of quality of practice. Because today, the lawyers at all the jurisdiction and territories have challenge of a better quality lawyer coming and appearing before the court virtually. And that kind of brings up the level of practice overall. From the cartels, the small areas, small courts, we are now moving truly on an equal and level playing field. So I just hope, not only for my own interest and the interest of the practitioners like me who are appearing across India or have the opportunity of appearing across India, but also for the benefit of the profession. On the side of corporate, I think it saves time, it saves cost, it is equally effective. All of us had a little bit of hesitation with the with online meetings and calls. Some issues of confidentiality still remain, and therefore those features I'm sure would be built up in premium version and other versions of different apps slowly. So I still have clients who usually wish to personally come over and discuss if they have an extremely confidential issue, but more and more they are getting comfortable. Even if their office is 10 minutes drive from our office, they do not wish to come, they prefer to have a video call. That's wonderful. Third thing that has happened on a funny side is that answering the questions have become very easy. If you don't know the answer to a question, you can just put yourself to mute and think about it. That is happening practically. That is happening in course. That is also happening in meetings. But that's on the funny side. That's my input on it. Thanks.
Yes, Mr. Nakvia, we can just Google the answer if we don't have appropriate pointers at the back of our hand. Indeed, yes, you've made very relevant points that some of us have become comfortable working from home, and it has indeed brought about benefits and prospects we were about earlier. So, Mr. Mehra, I would like to ask you the same question. Given that you, as we say in English, have been there, done that, you are in the startup space. So what do you think is the future of deal making? Are we going to a hybrid space, or is still in person better than virtual?
Definitely hybrid. Definitely. I think technology has made it even easier to look at what deals are there throughout the world, just not your city, country, and you can do much more what you used to do in office, because in office you'll say 9 to 5 and I wouldn't deal with a Australian lawyer who's also gone to sleep by the time. But now it gives you more flexibility. You can look both at your home and office together. But that's one. Second is the geographies. Sitting at home and looking at a deal, or even thinking whether a startup in a different side of the world, Israel or US or wherever, and you're not really thinking, oh, how will I kind of acquire or how will I fund? Because there are means available. You can reach out to a lawyer. There's a website. You have a lawyer's listing directory. You have business worlds who are categorizing, who are awarding the lawyers. And life now is even more interesting and I will say challenging to the effect, because everything is available, so you also do not have an escape about it. And third is, I think, taxation-wise, when you're really looking at a deal, we're not really there, but I would probably hope in the next 5-10 years, taxation becomes easier when you're acquiring or selling, because that's the major concern for a business. If those three sustain, I think we're good for the next 50 years or so, and then we can look at China and maybe move even further on that trajectory.
China seems to be a sore point for all of us over here, for anybody who wants the economy to do well.
By the way, China hasn't had those many IPOs this year because of the regulations that have come in. But if you compare it to India, India is much more leaped in those IPOs. And US is, of course, 113 billion more than what they did last year in IPOs. So I think that speaks volumes.
Yes, we are catching up on the IPO, startup, unicorn, you name it. Indian economy is doing really well on that front. Ms. Roy, I would like your closing comments on the same. What do you think is the future of digital or hybrid or in-person deal making? How would you see it?
So I think for me, a couple of things really jump out there. Of course, definitely, I think we're all in agreement on the whole hybrid piece, but I think it'll lead to a couple of additional things, right? Not just about whether we're working face-to-face or digitally, but so I think already most large companies across India had adopted technology like virtual data rooms, for example. But I think more and more smaller companies, startups, who are getting into this space will start looking a lot more at tools like virtual data rooms and other tech. The second thing is, I think, with the whole COVID situation that's played out and the impact it's had on businesses, is a greater need to add value from internal legal teams. And so, as internal lawyers, we're going to have to produce much more value on the table, and therefore we will also have to be very tight on our M&A budgets when using external counsel. And I think that's another space we're going to be using a lot of tech as we move into this model. And so, I'm really dependent on AI to see how we can reduce diligence, for example, or speed up diligence when we're looking at transactions. I think that's another thing. And I think the last thing is to all my external counsel colleagues, I think you all had it bad anyway. You all were working around the clock when it came to deal making. I think it's become a lot worse now because we're all in virtual mode and we've forgotten the 9-to-5 work week completely. And so I think there's a lot more pressure and sort of a round-the-clock approach to support from external partners.
Right, Mr. Saraf, we are almost at the end. So what would your closing comments be?
I think if you look at deal making virtually, I think this is going to stay for long, very long. Because court may go physical, but the deal making will not go physical. Because if you think about it, what really happened is that a lot of people like me who are on the wrong side of 50, we never were technology savvy. Now we've become technology savvy. And remember, every time we did a deal, we could not fix the date because somebody is not free, somebody's got a problem, this problem, that problem. Now that's no problem because you basically, you log in from home, maximum you will put off your camera. And therefore deal making, and that is the reason if you look at in last 6 months, our FDI flow is up by 90% over the same period because deal making is becoming easier. And that is going to, I remember when the pandemic broke, we did a corporate seminar. I'm the national executive of FICCI. So we did a seminar for corporates in India. You cannot believe there were 1,700 corporates which locked on to the seminar. And that lasted for 3 hours. And everybody had a problem that this is my labor issue, this is my rent issue, can you help me? And we could do that. 3 hours and 1,700 people. And that is, you can never do that physically. And that's the reason this is going to stay. I remember doing a deal for a global corporation during the pandemic. We virtually worked around the clock. And it was very crazy because really you can't say anything because you're all working at home. So really deal making will never get physical now. In my view, there'll be some deals, some shaking of hands and critical issues. People will go there. Now even IPOs, all the business presentations are all being done virtually. And that will be a good thing because really I feel, you asked what is really a big difference. You said you can mute your phone. But remember one thing, what has really changed is in physical meeting, you can get away with being not prepared. You can go and bullshit a lot of things about chai, coffee, lights, chandeliers, everything. But in a virtual meeting, there's no scope of bullshitting. Either you know, or if you mute, people know why you are muted. So I would say people come well prepared, very effective meetings are happening, and that is the reason why things have dramatically changed. So I would say this is going to be an irreversible process, and therefore guys, and particularly young students, you have to understand, I think really in a service industry, I think you virtually, it does eat up into your private time, but this is actually, deal making is going to be crazy. I remember people used to work for 3-4 years and get that experience, and now they are getting that same experience in 18 months. The deal making is almost double.
Okay, so with that, I would like to wind up our panel discussion, and none of our virtual panelists were on mute, so I like to believe that it was insightful and fruitful for them as well. With that, I'll like to thank you, Mr. Saraf, Mr. Mehra, Ms. Roy, and Mr. Naqvi for joining us. And that's it for the day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for listening to us patiently.